Will you shut up, man?
Listen, China ate your lunch, Joe. And
You're
by
the
way,
worst
you were a
president
vice-
America has ever had.
Hey,
Come
Joe,
on. I'm not here to call out his lies. Everybody knows he's a liar.
But you
I just
agree-
want to
Hey,
make sure.
Joe, you're the liar.
I want to make sure.
Graduated last in your class, not first in your class.
All right. My name is Ben Burgis, and this is Give Them an Argument, episode 9. Very shortly, I am going to be talking to Scottish Libertarian Anthony Samaroff. We are going to be continuing a friendly debate that we started a while ago on a different platform when we had a discussion about capitalism and exploitation. So I think we're going to get into some related issues here. After that, I am going to be interviewing Krystal from Rising, and that is pre-recorded, but we'll play that for you. And then, because David Griscom could not be here today for his usual Outlaws and Revolutionary segment, instead we're getting Cole James Cash, who is the musician who generously provided the intro music for this show. And we are going to be talking about his most political album, which is 2016. So a little genre switch there, but I'm looking forward to it. The sound you just heard, of course, was what I assume, and granted, right, I'm an atheist, so I feel a little silly making confident predictions about what the afterlife will be like if I'm wrong about all of that. But I tend to assume that is going to be the soundtrack for all eternity in hell, if hell exists. Meanwhile, though, I want to play you a few minutes of a different debate about the same subject, one that I had on Friday night on the Modern Day Debate platform with a right-wing YouTube person who calls himself Mr. Reagan, who some people might remember the previous debate that I had with him about systemic racism in the United States. This one was about the election. The way that it was originally pitched was that it was going to be about whether Trump or Biden was better for the future of the country. For reasons I'm going to get into in a minute, I asked for that to be changed. I was happy to argue with him about the election, but not in a way that put together Biden and future in any sort of optimistic way. So I am just going to show you a few minutes of that right now. I will say that trying to be detached about this as much as you can about your own performance. I don't think that Mr. Reagan, who silly name notwithstanding, man has 250,000 YouTube subscribers. So I figure even if only a very small percentage of them constitute fertile soil for planting seeds of doubt, it's still worth scattering some of those seeds. But you know, I think that in the first debate about racism, I think he did pretty badly. I think as far as I can give my detached professional opinion here, I don't think if we're going to play this game, won. The one about the election, I think he did better because he had all the sort of Trumpist talking points set and ready to go. He wasn't just trying to decide on the fly how to spin studies about, the callback rates for black and white job applicants or other results that I was bringing up in the racism debate that are a very, very tough fit with his narrative. But I think that the place that he did worse was when I tried to redirect it to the area that I've tried to laser focus in on. We, of course, inevitably spent a lot of it arguing about COVID, but the place, and in fact, you can hear in this part, right, the moderator's gotten a little sick of all the COVID talk, but the place that, other than that, I tried to laser focus in on is this question of the Trump administration's war on organized labor, what I was interviewing Paul Prescott about the other week. So here is just a few minutes about that. I think with regard to the media and its biases, I said my piece and then I didn't quite understand where it went after that.
Next up, last question we have here. Brian F., thanks for your question, said, overall, do you guys see the left or right trying to take away the freedoms from U.S. citizens and why?
Ben?
Well, I think that depending on which freedom that we're talking about, I think that some of our most important rights are rights in the workplace, which is where we spend half of our waking hours. And I spent a lot of my opening statement.
You are so old school socialist. It's
going
hilarious.
through a litany of ways in which the Trump administration has undermined the rights and protections of working people.
Give me an example.
Really? Okay.
One.
Okay, sure, absolutely. So we can look at, for example, the COVID era, NLRB rulings, where it's Trump's NLRB has ruled that employers are not obligated to bargain over paid sick leave and hazard pay. This is in places that are already union shops. Employers are also free from having to bargain over a temporary closure. And most disturbingly, the Trump-appointed board has declared that speaking out against your company's COVID safety procedures is not protected speech. In other words, you can be fired for raising concerns during a deadly pandemic. This is in addition to what I mentioned earlier about using COVID as a pretext to stop elections, to certify new unions. This is in addition to rulings from Trump's NLRB that, for example, when you have public spaces that are still part of an employer's property, like the area outside of a grocery store where you might see the Salvation Army, in the past, unions had to be allowed to use those public areas that were open to other groups in order to give workers information about, for example, a union they're trying to organize. That's no longer the case. Another example would be a Trump executive order about federal employees, making it harder for shop stewards to file grievances. So yeah, there's a long list of these things. Also, if we're going to look outside of the workplace, already mentioned Julian Assange, where I was very happy that that Chris agreed that is indeed very bad. What's happened there?
I'm not sure Trump is actually aggressively pursuing that. That was an Obama situation.
Well, the Obama administration actually made the decision not. I mean, they did tons of things in this area that I strongly disagree with. No question about that. I think in a lot of ways it was very, very bad on the national security, civil liberties stuff. But they did make the decision not to seek extradition of Assange on these charges, which doing so dramatically undermines freedom of the press. If you can go after a foreign journalist for encouraging the leaking of information that's classified within the United States, that really, really undermines our ability as Americans to find out bad stuff that our government is doing that we might want to look at. So I think that those are both areas in which the Trump administration has really undermined our freedoms. I also think that the encouragement of really heavy-handed responses, I'm not talking about riots and looting here, but to, in the overwhelming majority of cases, peaceful protests, which has included lots of attacks on journalists. All right, so that should give you a flavor of that discussion. Of course, as I was talking to my opponent for a few minutes after the recording ended, as he pointed out, he was in a better position starting out because he's arguing in favor of voting for a candidate who he actually, bless his heart, likes, Donald Trump, whereas I was arguing in favor of making a grim strategic decision to vote for a candidate that I loathe, Joe Biden. As obviously I tried very hard to get Bernie Sanders nominated instead. And I was thinking about this today because actually just a few minutes before I'd start recording the episode, I filled out my mail-in ballot and I voted for the ballot measure to require searches for require warrants for certain kind of electronic searches, for a couple of other obvious things like that, for some union endorsed candidates for Lansing Community College Board of Trustees, but also since I am voting in Michigan, I voted for Joe Biden, a man who is dripping with the blood of Iraqis who died in shock and awe in 2003, of teenagers in Pakistan who died during drone strikes at weddings and funerals, a man who spent decades acting more like a senator representing credit card companies than the senator from the state of Delaware, and who, not for nothing, is a candidate whose cognitive decline, I think, is an actual issue. So as I was doing that, right, I remember, right, it's an hour ago. I shouldn't talk about cognitive decline, but they had in the envelope this "I voted by mail" sticker. And all I could think is, oh my God, I can't imagine actually wearing this, because it's one thing to vote for the candidate who I just described, because you think, okay, it's a swing state, a small number of leftists might theoretically make a difference. It's not out of the question. And this is strategically the move that you have to make in order to prevent the most catastrophic consequences of the continuing COVID crisis, and to stop Trump's appointees to the courts and to the National Labor Relations Board from stamping out what's left of organized labor in the United States. But are you really going to brag about it? It's like, if you have a beloved family pet who needs to be euthanized to stop their suffering, you might make that grim, awful trip to the vet. But are you really going to go around wearing an "I killed my dog" sticker? So, like I said, that's a debate I am willing to have because it's important, but it's not a particularly fun one. In fact, it's one that, as Matt Christman so often reminds us, really indicates the extent to which we live in hell world, that you have to make those choices in the first place. So I take with great relief today the fact that I get to take a break from arguing about this Sophie's Choice stuff, about which of these monsters to vote for in the general election, and I get to spend a little bit of time today arguing about broader philosophical questions about how to think about capitalism and socialism and freedom and individual rights and all of that good stuff, with somebody who I profoundly disagree with, but is a intelligent and thoughtful interlocutor. Make sure you unmute yourself, Anthony. So this is Anthony Samaroff. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself for people who might not be familiar with you?
Hi, Ben. It's a great honor to appear in your new show. Excuse me. Let's get that out of the way. Hello, everyone. Thank you for bearing witness to our second conversation. It's good to be here in the Lions Den, speaking to people who have disagreements with me. I'm a libertarian writer. You can find a lot of my articles, including articles on Marx and Mises.org. I'm the author of a book called Universal Basic Income for and Against, which I've been told is a very even-handed book where I present the arguments in favor of the universal basic income, and as well as those against, and also offer some alternatives from a libertarian perspective on ways that I think we could significantly increase living standards for people at the bottom of the economic ladder.
All right, thank you for that, Anthony.
I don't think too much about. Sorry, I was just saying I don't think too much about
cut off for a second.
rich
Keep
people.
going.
Did I? I was just saying I don't think too much about rich people. I mostly think about poor people. So,
okay. Well,
guess we can take
that's as good an entry point as any. So since you have indicated that you are willing to come back for repeat performances after today, so I'm not too worried about what range of subjects that we end up covering. We can keep going in future installments, but what you just said is as good an entry point as any, right? So you say that you're not primarily, when you make this libertarian critique of statism, of doing government redistribution, that you're not primarily concerned with the welfare of rich people. You're primarily concerned with the welfare of poor people. But I mean, just to start out, right? Like one obvious case in point, right? So I guess when you say you're a libertarian, I take it that you don't just mean like what sometimes like a certain kind of Republican in the United States might say, oh, I have some libertarian leanings or
Yes.
whatever, right? But like you really mean that if there is any legitimate role for the government, and actually I'm not sure if you think there is or not, or if you go all the way to anarcho-capitalism, but if there is a legitimate role for government, it would purely be preventing force and fraud. It's not to be in the business of doing things like providing healthcare and education. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, that would be fair.
Okay. So for example, right, that means that where you live, there's something called the National Health Service, by virtue of which everybody can get their health care provided for free at publicly owned hospitals, and so I think an obvious response when you say that you're mostly concerned with with poor people is I don't imagine that most people in Scotland would want to trade places with Americans who have to worry, for example, that
Sure.
if they lose their job, they'd lose their health insurance. But I mean, I take it you would want to abolish the NHS. You don't think that's a legitimate government function?
Yeah, I would say ultimately I would abolish the NHS, but I don't think that would be a starting point. The first thing would be to completely deregulate the private provision of healthcare so that the kind of innovations that you would see in the fall in price could then influence the National Health Service and ultimately make it redundant. I mean, we could unpack this topic for hours, Ben, but it's not correct that everyone here has access to healthcare. We've got maybe approaching 5 million on waiting lists, and this is in a country of 70 million people. Old people are outright refused services. We have lots of rationing. People love the NHS until they're in it. I'm not going to defend the American system. The American government spends more per head on healthcare than the UK government is, and you don't even have a national health service.
Right, which certainly suggests to me that that trying to provide subsidies and do things like that, have this patchwork system is a much less efficient use of money because if in the UK
right.
you have 5 million people on various sorts of waiting lists in a country of 70 million, that means that that 65 million, right? That's about 93% of the population is not in that situation.
Okay, but we're talking about the people with
compare that to the tens of millions of people in the United States, making up a much bigger percentage of the population who don't have any sort of health insurance at all. So if they have something that might be nothing and might be cancer, then they have to think about things like, okay, do I want to go to the doctor after all? There's a good chance that it's nothing, and I really can't afford to pay for that right now because I'll be paying for it out of pocket. And so presumably you don't want that to happen, right? So in your view, what's behind door number 3, right? If you don't like the
Okay, that's a great question. Yeah, okay, so I think it's not fair to say 65 million people do have access to healthcare, because we want to look at the people who actually have conditions that might land them on a waiting list. The fact is that regularly.
Hold on.
Wait a second. Can we do one? Can we do one at a time? Can I just develop my point?
But I'm really going to want to go back to that because I think that's a really interesting claim. But keep going.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. When routinely people are seen next day in the USA for things that people are put on a waiting list here. Again, I don't want to defend the United States medical system. That is a crony capitalist system. In many cases, people can't even open a hospital without going to a board and justifying the need for the hospital. And some people on the board will be administrators from the hospital that exist in the same area and what have you. People are banned from buying insurance from states other than their own. There's tons of ways where the government pushes the price of healthcare through the roof in the United States. But what the two systems have in common is third-party payers of some kind, which means that healthcare isn't subject to the discretion of the consumer, where they can say they can get a better healthcare at a better price. They don't have the option of taking their business elsewhere. So that does not create a upward pressure in quality and downward pressure in price as we see in other industries which are largely left to the free market.
So just to clarify the point, right? That you're.
So what's behind door number 3? Well, that's
okay. Well, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying, right? So they have a so your objection is that we have insurance in the first place, so there's this third party that's in the picture. I'm sure coffee would cost a lot more if you had coffee insurance and they were building
sure.
it. They were building
That's
it
one
for a
example.
coffee company, right? All right, I'll buy that, right? But I guess what I get a little confused by, and maybe you're about to say this in door number 3, is how exactly you're going to avoid that, because people can pay for healthcare out of pocket right now, right? They don't choose, they don't generally choose to do so if they can possibly help it, because the costs are so exorbitant. And you could say, okay, the costs are only so exorbitant because most people are charging it to insurance rather than paying for it out of pocket. But since presumably you don't want to ban insurance, right? That would go against libertarian principles. How do we go about getting into a situation where most people are not using health insurance?
Sure. Okay, so people can have insurance for things that are unpredictable and things like that. That's fine. I think that broadly speaking, we don't really have. I think our systems have more in common than they have in part, which is that they're essentially systems of sick care, not healthcare. The only thing that's remunerated within these systems is the treatment of ill health. Everyone gets paid for treating sickness, and you've seen, the excesses of the pharmaceutical industrial complex and what have you. They're protected by patents from the government, which I disagree with. The move towards ensuring everything happens when during the war there was a ban on increasing wages, so companies started giving people health insurance and other perks and things like that, and health insurance is not taxed at the same time as other income, so employers are incentivized to give people benefits in the form of health insurance when actually they might actually like the money in their pocket to spend on whatever they want, not being overinsured. This is an extremely complicated issue, but I would just say this: if you wanted a halfway house, I think the best thing to do would be for the government, rather than to say subsidize people with Medicare and Medicaid and encourage them to take out insurance, is just to put some money every month in a savings account for people that they could then draw down from when they had some kind of medical emergency or to gain healthcare services. The reason for that is it would at least simulate a market in which there was truly open competition, which would put a downward pressure on price of services and an upward pressure in the quality of services.
One problem with that is that if you have a health savings account, that healthcare costs are so wildly unpredictable, and which means that of course you might have this downward pressure on prices that you're talking about, because if not enough people, right, can afford it at the out-of-pocket price that you're talking about, then fewer people will buy it, and that'll provide an incentive to eventually lower that price. But meanwhile, if you just can't afford your radiation treatments for cancer, you're not going to be getting them, and there's an obvious concern that you have that you could have a situation where enough people can afford it at the higher price bracket, that especially for certain kinds of specialized services, things that are more that are innately more expensive because the machinery involved, et cetera, that like many products, right, it could still be worth it to the providers to sell it at the higher price point for people who can just directly afford it out of pocket, or who, in addition to the health savings account, can afford health insurance that's taxed at a normal rate. Whereas a lot of people end up without something like Medicaid, end up being left out in the cold. I'd also say that all systems, like you talked earlier, right? I just want to make sure this doesn't get lost, right? You talked earlier about people on waiting lists, which I agree is the bitter fruit of decades of Tory and New Labor cuts to the NHS, and stealth undermining and privatizing bits and pieces of it, which is appalling. And of course, there's a vicious cycle, because doing those things to undermine it, right, then leads to shortages that can then be used as an excuse to paint the system in a negative light and thus justify future cuts. But all systems, right, even a really well-funded one, sure, you get some rationing around the edges, because all systems have finite resources. The question is, when you run up to the limits of those finite resources and you can't cover everything for everybody, is the rationing done on the basis of money, like it is in the United States, or is it done on the basis of something else? And a relatively fairly administered waiting list strikes me as vastly more just than people who can afford something getting to buy their way to the head of the line.
No, I don't agree with that, because long-term, people who can afford to buy things getting to the head of the line are putting money into the system, which then will attract more service providers to that service and bring the price down over the long term, so more people get access. But the thing is, when you're speaking, your challenge, when you're saying, oh, you know, some people are not going to afford it if you've got a health savings account, I think that number would be vastly lower than under the current system. Because the prices of services are and there's so much fraud, the prices of services are so vastly inflated compared to what they would be in a free market. Sorry, Ben, let me develop my point, because I gave you quite a lot of time.
But you're saying something that I think it's important we don't lose. But finish up your point.
That's fine. So the thing is, you're speaking like we can create some there's the resources are always going to be limited so long. There comes a point at when someone's going to say, how much money are you going to pay to save someone 1 year of life? It's morbid as hell, but at some point the government administrators are going to decide who can live and who can die. And the problem is, with our system, people are not aware of that, and at some point they may have made different decisions during their lifetime. Did they know that at 70 years of age they're going to be denied services outright? And no one here makes provisions for that, because they believe that they're covered.
But yes, of course, that's absolutely true what you just said, right? That I don't know that most people don't know that. I think everybody knows that. I think they make the rational calculation that it's better when you run up against those limits, when those morbid choices have to be made, which, of course, a better funded version of the NHS, you'd have to make fewer of them, of course. It's been undermined for decades. But of course, in any system, you'd have to make some of them. The question is, what should be used to decide when that happens?
Yes, I agree that decision is to be made.
Do you let people higher up the socioeconomic spectrum buy their way to the head of the line, or do you try to have some relatively even-handed system applying fair, impartial rules to decide how those scarce resources get allocated?
Right, I see the point you're making, but I don't think you're actually taking into account how much cheaper healthcare services would be on a free market. You know, there's the Oklahoma Surgery Center, the surgery center in Oklahoma, which routinely does things over the counter, sometimes for 1/10 of the price that other hospitals are claiming insurance for. So I think with on a free market system, yes, you know, you'd have to have charities, you'd have to have cooperatives, in some cases insurance, you'd have charity hospitals, healthcare workers that are volunteering and so forth.
So some
but
people just go
also,
to a charity hospital if there's
yeah,
one in their area,
yeah,
whereas
yeah,
other
but
people get world-class health
yeah,
care at a
yes, they
much better
can. Yeah,
hospital.
yeah, and and I have to bite the bullet and say I'm not necessarily adverse to that. I think those people who go and pay for the class healthcare system, they're shoveling money into the system that is then going to attract more service providers by the law of supply and demand, and that will bring the prices of service down, making them more affordable to ordinary people, just the same way that those who are silly enough to buy the new laptop or the new iPhone as soon as it comes out are basically subsidizing people who wait a couple of years to get it later. It seems inegalitarian at the front end of it, but
Well,
at the tail end of
it literally is inegalitarian.
yeah,
Right?
no, it is an egalitarian.
As a matter of life and death, some people
on the
have a
long,
better chance
on the long term,
depending on their income.
on the long term, even from a utilitarian perspective, I think it's going to turn out far better results.
So let's think about that prediction, right? That in the long term, it'll turn out better. I would say
for most people.
I would say parenthetically that there are non-utilitarian things or things that aren't directly utilitarian in terms of the most obvious metrics that should be taken into account here, like dignity, right? Should you have to beg on GoFundMe to get life-saving medical care versus should it be your right as a citizen? But as far as the utilitarian calculations, at least as far as the real world options, right? You can speculate about how what you would regard as a really true free market would play out in practice. I can speculate about how I think it would play out in practice, but as far as the data that we have about things that have actually been implemented on a national scale, then the evidence is pretty clear. So people where you are live longer on average, die of treatable diseases less than people where I live. And so you could say, okay, sure, so maybe the NHS performs vastly better by every single metric than the American healthcare system in terms of the purpose, like lowering infant mortality, extending life.
But Ben, why are you choosing the American system?
I'm sorry, Anthony, you didn't let me cut you off earlier. So, as far as all of these crucial metrics, the British system performs vastly better than the American system. The Canadian system performs vastly better than the American system, etc. Now, you could say, sure, some hypothetical system might perform even better, right? Just kind of the same way that if we're talking about the failures of Soviet planning, somebody who is an ultra-leftist could say, okay, but that wasn't real communism, and because they still had commodities and Soviet citizens were still paid in rubles, so if they'd gone all the way to real communism, it would have performed way better. And maybe, but if we're going to stay grounded in what's actually played out in the real world, the evidence is overwhelming that socialized systems perform far better than systems with more significant market elements.
Right, okay. First of all, you're poisoning the well and you're cherry picking. It's interesting that you choose America as an example of a capitalist or a free market healthcare system when it's the provisions highly regulated in every single way imaginable. But you don't mention, say, Singapore, which has one of the best.
Singapore is vastly less free market than the United States. Singapore
outcomes in the world, right?
Singapore has Obamacare on steroids.
When it comes to healthcare, right? Then you look at, say, something that like the Netherlands, where they have more of a, they have mandatory insurance, but people can shop around. And I think, as far as I can tell, most of the services in Singapore are paid for over the counter, even if it is with government money. So people are shopping around. In America, you can't. I never at any point said that I was going to defend the American system.
No, I understand.
But the fact is, almost all of
that's not my point. My point is that if you compare countries like Singapore,
America is the single greatest innovator in healthcare.
Okay, so do you think that
right.
that innovation? Do you think that medical
But
innovation?
no, what I'm saying is,
is a result of private health insurance.
in countries where we have socialized healthcare, we actually benefit from being able to employ innovations that were made in the private system
Yes,
in America.
that's a very common
Uh,
argument. The reason that I find that very unpersuasive is that if you actually look at medical innovation in the United States, most of it's happening in government labs, especially when we're talking about NMEs, new molecular entities, as opposed to just taking something that's already been developed, quite likely at a government lab by the National Institutes for Health or at some public university, and tweaking it a little bit to patent it. And I would also point out that if we're going to broaden the discussion to the private pharmaceutical industry, that we've all been living since March with the bitter fruits of the decisions of that private pharmaceutical industry, and really the incentives of that private pharmaceutical industry. Because even after MERS and SARS, which were both near misses with respiratory ailments becoming a pandemic on this scale, there was no big push to do research into other respiratory ailments. Why not? Because the short-term profit incentives of the pharmaceutical companies aren't really served by doing things like looking ahead to possible threats that might be coming up in the next few years and thinking like that. They're really incentivized to think in terms of quarterly profit projections. So when the coronavirus happened, by the way, a direct result of deregulation in China, lifting the ban on selling wild meat at wet markets, when the coronavirus happened, we were left out in the cold because of the incentives built in to having the pharmaceutical industry be a for-profit thing.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't know if this is congruent what you're saying in addition to, or the last I heard, the FDA ruled that the CDC was the only company that was allowed to make tests at the beginning of the pandemic, and then the CDC's tests didn't even work. So if they just let the pharmaceuticals make companies make tests, then maybe we would have had testing kits sooner. In addition to that, sorry, Ben, can we please go one at a time? As my philosophy professor used to say, one fool at a time.
Well, I'm trying to, but you keep on expressing a thought and then moving on to two or three more thoughts, and I keep wanting to go back to the first thought, but say what you're going to say.
Well, I mean, I'm giving you as much time as you need, so it would be good to get as much time as I need.
Right? But that's okay.
If the FDA, you know, the alcohol companies said that they were able to manufacture sanitizers when there was a shortage of sanitizers, and the FDA told them that they couldn't do it unless they put poison in it to stop people from drinking. And they said, well, we don't have the infrastructure to do that. And said, oh, well, then I guess you can't manufacture hand sanitizer, even though we're in the middle of a shortage.
Very soon at the beginning of the pandemic, so I'm not sure about that particular story. But the broader question is, why is it that there had not been research into respiratory ailments going on a large scale from the pharmaceutical companies?
I don't understand how the pharmaceutical companies don't have an incentive to do that. They would be raking it in if they'd done that.
They would be raking it in because this happened. But the question is, years ago, right? Are they thinking, okay, there's like a 5% chance that this will happen?
Who can predict every possible eventuality?
You can't predict every.
If there's a 5%.
So why do eventuality? But that's not the question. Look at the way that, for example, Pentagon funding works, right? Are they only building tanks as needed for wars that have already started, or are they being asked to say, okay, here are a bunch of things that might happen. Of course, they're not going to cover every eventuality, but here are a lot of things that we're concerned with, and let's be prepared for all of those, because you can have that with public systems in a way that you can't with companies that are going to be very narrowly focused on what's going to happen to their stock in the near future.
I think if you could have that with public agencies, you would have had that. I mean, I don't really see why the government was better placed to predict this than the pharmaceutical industry was. If I knew we were going to be debating, healthcare, I would have specifically designed my talking points for this conversation.
No, well, fair enough. I mean, I didn't think so either. This is just kind of where it went. But the point is not that the government is better positioned to predict it in the first place. The point is that anybody could have predicted it, but because we had pharmaceutical production largely in the hands of for-profit private companies. They didn't have an incentive to focus on that, because the incentive isn't, oh hey, this could potentially be a big problem in a couple of years. The incentive is, what are we going to be able to sell a lot of this year? Whereas if you take it out of the market, you have less of that incentive. I do also want to get a question for you that
I think
asked
companies are constantly making long-term decisions. Sure, yeah. Let's go. Let's hear the question.
Okay, it's completely off topic, but it was asked a while ago, so I just want to make sure we don't lose it. So do you want to finish what you were saying about this first?
Well, first of all, I just want to circle back. You said that the healthcare outcomes are better here. I don't think that's got anything to do with our health service. I think that's a lot to do with American lifestyles being a lot worse than they are. What we really need to be looking at is...
I've been to Scotland. I know what you have for breakfast there.
Well, I don't. I'm a vegetarian, but I'm more than willing to grant that a lot of people's diet here are unhealthy too. I'm not sure we have as much of this corn syrup sugar that you guys seem to love over there, but
no. But
yeah,
I think when you compare the U.S. to Canada, I think that the lifestyle of Canadians is extremely similar to the lifestyle of Americans. And so you get similar kinds of disparities there, which is one of the reasons that I find that unconvincing.
Given that we do have, given that most of the healthcare costs are going to treat illnesses that are preventable and are lifestyle related, what are we going to do about this? I don't just want to fucking talk about economics with you, excuse my language. It's like, I'm a mental health professional, right? I'm a therapist. I'm like, why is everyone fucking themselves up? Why is the conversation not about, what? I know you're probably going to come back and say, it's the capitalist system, stupid. That's why everyone's addicted to things.
I do not think those two things are unrelated, but
okay.
But
I mean,
I do hear what you're saying, and just
the conversation should be about that. But definitely, if you're, my fundamental point is we don't have healthcare systems. We have sick care systems. If I went to a financial advisor and he said to me, well, do you know what, Anthony? When your account's making money, I'll make less. And when it's losing money, I'll make more. Then I would actually expect my account to go down in value, not up in value. So basically, I think the way we think of healthcare needs to change, and would potentially change on an actual free market, which is that you would contract with people to help keep you well. They get paid more when you were doing well rather than when you were doing sick. That's a discussion we can have maybe another time.
That's entirely fair. I also, before we get to the question from earlier, there's another question that came in that is, well, okay, it's not really a question, but I'll read it anyway and let you react to it. Anthony Mark says, why is research for new broad spectrum antibiotics only performed by the government? Is because it's too unprofitable to justify the research despite the need for them, given the prevalence of extensively drug-resistant bacteria and fungi.
Okay.
Okay, since I think there's that literally at any point, I think that at any point we bring this up, we are going to be deep in the middle of what we were talking about. So at a certain point, we just have to do it. So the totally off-topic question that you have here, and although actually I'm just sort of fascinated to hear because I literally have no idea, is Jeremy Salmon asks, what is Anthony's take on Scottish independence?
Okay, that's fair enough. I get asked that a lot. I guess it's an inevitability. I'm ambivalent about it. I guess, broadly speaking, I prefer smaller political units over bigger ones. I feel both Scottish and British personally, for what my personal sentiments are. I don't particularly, I do worry that I don't want them to turn this into the People's Republic of Scotland. I'm sure you'd feel quite at home there, but Scotland's a little bit more left-wing on economic issues than England is. So I guess
Free Scotland.
I'm tentatively in favour of Scottish independence, but not strongly in favour. I'm also, I think, tentatively against it, but not strongly against it.
All
Depends
right.
what day you catch me on.
All right, that is entirely fair. Anthony, I want you to come back in a few weeks, and we won't talk about healthcare every time, because I know that we could have spent 10 hours on that.
Okay.
But
I've got a request for your audience. Okay.
Yeah,
On my YouTube channel, there is a video called Medicare for All, and I would ask you to go and check it out. It's only half an hour long. You can also listen to it on the Scottish Liberty podcast feed if you prefer to listen to it. Leave your YouTube comments. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm right. I don't care. But check it out. I tried to do some research for that one. I think you'll find it quite informative.
All right, fair enough. So actually, I think a really fun exercise, and I'm saying this not having watched the video yet myself, I will check it out. But you can watch Anthony's video. You can read my article in Current Affairs called "The Many Bad Arguments Against Medicare for All." And if Anthony makes arguments that aren't covered in that article, then those are probably ones that I haven't thought of. So if we ever do return to the subject of healthcare, those would be good ones to talk about. But I know that we have a lot of other subjects to cover. So if I can get you back in a few weeks, we'll move on to one of those.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for having me, Ben.
All right. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'm now joined by Krystal Ball, the co-host of The Rising. We'll talk a little bit about the election, related stuff. So thank you so much for coming on, Krystal.
Thank you for having me, Ben. It's great to chat with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I always really enjoyed watching you on the Michael Brooks show, and so yeah, this is great. I'm excited about this. So as we are recording this is a pre-record. So this is the day after the Pence-Harris debate, which is as good an entry point as anything.
Riveting stuff right there.
So I guess like one of the most interesting and maybe disturbing things about that debate was to put it uncharitably but not I think inaccurately, Harris received "you support serious action on climate change" as like a smear.
Right. Yeah, that was maybe the most frustrating part of the debate, is on that issue, on healthcare, on even who you should be working with and who you should be quote unquote unifying with. Basically, Biden and Harris have accepted the right-wing framing. They've accepted the right-wing framing that fracking is good and we should be all in on fracking. They've accepted the right-wing framing that the Green New Deal is bad and that to be tarred as a supporter of the Green New Deal is a terrible thing. And, you know, I'll be frank, I haven't seen any polling particularly recently, but the polling at the beginning of the year on the Green New Deal had overwhelming majority support. Now, what I suspect will happen is when you see not only Republicans attacking the Green New Deal, but also Democrats attacking the Green New Deal, it's going to kill it, right? Because the public looks at that as a signal of like, oh, you know, everybody's against this thing. Only crazy people are for saving the planet and creating hundreds of thousands of new jobs. So this must be a terrible thing. And to me, that's like writ large what the Democratic Party does over and over and over again, accept the right-wing framing and cut off the possibility of progress.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the creating the new jobs is kind of the key part, because it seems like you think, okay, well, why is it that they're taking, you know, that they're saying, oh no, that's a smear. We don't want to stop fracking, right? You know, fracking's great. Well, some of it might be about donor influence, of course, right? I mean, that's always in the mix, but like, it also seems like some of it is that since everybody well, you know, Trump is pretending not to know it, right? But like everybody knows that they're not going to do anything like the Green New Deal. So given that, being against fracking, for example, would just mean a bunch of people are going to lose their jobs because they can't do the pitch that Bernie could have done, which is, these particular jobs are going to go away, but a whole bunch of new ones are going to be created instead.
That's actually such a great point, and why the innovation of the Green New Deal and that framing was so important and such an innovation in terms of the environmentalism movement, because you always had this, like, you know, this trade-off of, oh, if you're opposed to fracking, that means you're going to kill jobs. And if you don't have it as part of a comprehensive framework that people can wrap their heads around, then that's going to be a hard argument to win. I will say, though, the polling that's out there on fracking, even in the state of Pennsylvania, is not what people think it is. There's the most recent polling has actually a majority in the state of Pennsylvania support for banning fracking. And, you know, I don't want to project my own impressions on the matter. It's very complicated. I'm sure people feel lots of ways, but I used to live in that area in Ohio, and I would live there at a time when fracking was just sort of coming into fruition. People were really excited about the possibility of job creation, but it ended up not being the boon to the economy and the lifeline that they ultimately thought it would be. I've worked a lot in, I've done some work in West Virginia politics, and obviously famously they've been completely exploited by like the coal barons there and had all the natural resources sucked out and kept the people in poverty. And the natural gas industry with fracking is doing basically the same thing. It's really by and large not the local people who have benefited. It's been these large conglomerates, outsiders coming in who buy up the rights to the natural gas or the mineral rights. And so I don't think that it's the panacea for people in those states that maybe national leaders kind of clumsily perceive it to be.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm also wondering about the other end of that, which is, you know, like Pence accusing Harris and Biden of supporting these things, which seems like a big shift that we've seen since 2016, because because in 2016, Trump's big line of attack against Hillary was that she was in bed with Goldman Sachs and, you know, and globalists and that she wasn't, you know, supporting the interests of ordinary working class people. And now there's still like a little bit of that, right? They'll do ads where they talk about creating jobs and things like that. But it seems like the big line of attack now is that, you know, Biden is secretly a communist, and you know, like that seems like what the Trump campaign has had to go with this time, which seems like maybe it has a lot to do with the fact that none of the economic rhetoric that they used in 2016 really had anything to do with almost anything that's happened since then.
That's exactly right. And I mean, Trump has just morphed into like whatever threads of an idea he had back in 2016. Now he's talking to like Larry Kudlow and Art Laffer, and Fox News boomer brain has basically like infected his mind. So he's rolled out the same attacks against Joe Biden and Kamala Harris that Republicans from time immemorial have rolled out against Democrats. Really, the only exception to that was 2016 and the way that he very effectively went after Hillary Clinton. And here's what's so amazing. The great irony is that as he's been attacking Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, something maybe unprecedented in American politics has happened. Their favorability ratings have gone up. That's how bad of an attack, like that never happens, okay? Over the course of a campaign, it's ugly, it's vicious. Favorability ratings inevitably go down no matter who you are. Theirs have actually gone up because the attack is so bad. And I think also because he's been so just absurdly terrible that in contrast, people are like, well, they're better than that guy. But I also think there's something to like people right now, if you ask them if, you know, about a UBI, it's like 80% support. Medicare for all is up to, you know, universal healthcare is up to like 60, 70% support. People actually want left-wing economics, right? They want the government to do something. To the extent that the attack landed at all, maybe it convinced people that Joe is going to do more for them than they thought, and that he actually is going to do.
Right. Biden might be getting undeserved credit for actually.
Right, exactly. They're like, oh, maybe he will give me. I didn't really think he was going to do healthcare, but who knows? Man, Trump says he will, so maybe.
No, that makes sense. I guess I'm also wondering about your thoughts about the more general phenomenon, right? Because obviously 2016, like you said, I mean, it was this kind of different thing that happened on the Republican side, that they decided they were at least going to use a lot of populist rhetoric, and that, you know, there was at least some, you know, Trump said he wasn't going to cut entitlements, and there were some attacks on trade deals, which I guess is the only part that's sort of become, you know, reality since then. You know, they've renegotiated some of that. But I guess from my perspective, right, maybe you have a different take on some of this. It seems like even just beyond Trump personally, that whole populist turn by that part of the right, like it seems like, you know, increasingly, right, like that there's not a lot of there, right, that like that if you that even the people who are most associated with it, you know, like well, I guess Steve Bannon, Joshua Hawley, you know, some of these people, right, you know, that they have, that if you actually like really dig into it, like so for example, right, I remember couple years ago, there was this monk debate between Steve Bannon and David Frum about the future of politics. And it was this like really like heavy thing. And the whole thing, if you watched it, it was just Frum sort of throwing rhetoric at Bannon for an hour, insinuating he's a fascist, and then Bannon throwing back a bunch of like rhetoric about working class deplorables. But in the entire thing, there's really like no policy discussed at all.
Yeah.
And then more recently, actually this year, Bannon went on a podcast called Red Scare, where a lot of people were like upset with them for even having him on because they're, you know, platforming him. But I thought it was actually incredibly useful because in that discussion, they asked a question, like this really incredibly simple question, which is, if you're such a populist, why don't you support Medicare for all? And it seems like that same question could be applied to almost all of these guys, certainly anybody who's anywhere near any kind of like power or media influence.
I completely agree. And Josh Hawley is a perfect example because in terms of members of Congress, he's been really sort of held up as the example, right, of this new direction. And you just look at the Amy Coney Barrett confirmation fight. And look, yes, abortion is the bright red flashing issue. It's the thing the media wants to talk about because it's easy to talk about, like culture wars, easy to do, right? And it's the thing the right has been obsessed about for decades. The reality is a lot of what the Supreme Court is going to have to do has to do with labor rights, as you know, has to do with corporate power, has to do with antitrust. These are things that Josh Hawley has pretended to care about. Yet there's none of that critical commentary about Amy Coney Barrett, who has a dreadful record from what we've seen so far with regards to just handing the, you know, everything over to corporations and being totally subservient to corporate power. So suddenly, you know, all of that part has just been erased. And, you know, his record, he's, you know, for right to work, I mean, he's against any sort of labor rights, all of that stuff is completely hollow. So I think you had a lot of people who saw what Trump pulled off and thought this could work as a path to power. Like he's on to something. And the truth is he was on to something, because regardless of where you are on the ideological spectrum, where I am on the ideological spectrum, there is a large group of American voters who are left economics and right culturally.
Right.
And that perspective is not reflected at all in our politics. Like you can't think of one person who actually is in leadership or in the judiciary who represents that part of American politics. And so the fact that Trump spoke at all to that kind of quadrant, which is the most underrepresented, I think, of any part. I mean, I would argue actually the true left is completely underrepresented as well, but that quadrant of American politics just goes without any representation. But what you see with Trump, and he doesn't really have any ideology. It just comes down to who's the most loyal to him and who's in his ear, and, whatever he's feeling that day is, all over the place. But what it comes down to in terms of the Republican Party is there's just too much money. There's too much think tank infrastructure. There's just too much behind keeping them in this totally pro-corporate space, which means that, they can just kind of hide that part away, put the culture war front and center. By the way, I think the Democratic Party does their own version of this, because that way, all you have to do, you don't have to actually pass any legislation. Right. You don't have to actually provide for people's material needs. You don't have to actually challenge anyone who's difficult to challenge, who has power. All you have to do is say the right words and signal that you're on the right side of those battles, and people will yes, queen you all day long. Right. And so I think that's, truly, Kamala Harris, perfect example. Really, Elizabeth Warren at this point, sad as I am to say that, perfect example. She runs her presidential campaign. The woman who, used to talk about the 2-income trap, and Joe Biden can't be called a champion of women when he sells them out in the morning and then pretends to be their friend in the evening, or whatever her original quote is, comes down to I'm going to wear a pink Planned Parenthood scarf at my inauguration, right?
And
she gets props for
the
it.
Entire primary, she never once brought up at a single debate the bankruptcy bill, which was her origin story, because that would have meant attacking Biden. And I guess maybe she'd already made the calculation that that might not be a good idea.
Yeah, to me, the DNC, when she's there doing her bit with the BLM blocks, children's blocks in the background, it's bad enough that happened. What really made me lose my mind is the number of people were like, that's amazing. It's doing anything. It's not doing anything, nothing. But that's so much easier than actually legislating, than actually being accountable, than actually fighting power. And you get so many props, and you ascend to the highest levels, and you get to talk to Joe Biden or whatever is your heart's desire. And so, yeah, that's basically the hellscape that we live in currently.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah,
on a happy note there.
Yeah. I appreciate that. But right, no, for sure. And I think that maybe in Warren's case, part of the reason was that, it's not just about, Elizabeth Warren as a person, although, whatever, there's probably a lot you can say about that at this point, but it's also that it seems like the sort of coalition that she was trying to build was really leaning on these kind of suburban liberal voters who are not, who might be okay with, to a certain extent, a certain amount of social democracy.
Oh, yeah.
I think are probably going to be made, a little, clearly they weren't comfortable with the Bernie approach. They would have supported Bernie Sanders, right? That's so. So
I think the problem with that type of voter is that the economic issues are never going to be their priority. Mm-hmm. So they will probably tell you by and large that they supported Medicare for all. Mm-hmm. If you poll them, you'll get pretty good economic responses. This is something I see Matt Iglesias arguing, right? He's look, they're more economically liberal than the population. This is a coalition that you can work with. And maybe he's right. But I look at Virginia, which is the state that I live in and grew up in. And this is a blue state now. The governor's Democrat, the House, the Senate, everybody's Democratic. And it is still number 51 out of 51 on workers' rights. They passed the ERA, right? They did. I mean, and these are things I support. They, passed this and that Equality Act. They dealt with the Confederate monuments. Those things they prioritized. And the workers' issues, the minimum wage, collective bargaining in the public sector, all those things were pushed off, put on the back burner, maybe next time, maybe next time, maybe next time. And so there's still 51st out of 51 in terms of workers' rights, a blue state. And so that's the problem, is that those suburban voters will never hold politicians accountable on those economic issues. They will never prioritize them. Those aren't the things that tickle their fancy. Those aren't the things that they'll, skip their brunch for. And so you end up with a Virginia kind of progressivism, which is all, culture issues, which I'm not going to say don't matter. They do. And representation, all those things matter. But if you're actually talking about building out a multiracial working class coalition, like a society that is decent to people and cares about the dignity of workers and economic rights, you are never going to get there with a coalition that is centered on the desires of white suburban affluent elites. You're just not. Now, the one thing I've been thinking, I'm actually curious your thoughts on this, Ben, because this is something that I'm not settled on it at all. So I think forward in the Democratic Party and 2024, and I know it's sort of disgusting to think about these things, but whatever, that's what I've been doing. And whether there will be an opportunity to primary either Kamala or Joe, depending on, whether Joe decides to run another time. I think that the most likely winning coalition in a Democratic primary would probably be the young, like what Ed Markey was able to pull off, the young Bernie left, multiracial, and the sort of white, affluent, liberal type Warren voters. Like that's who backed Markey by and large. And I think if you were going to put together a coalition to defeat Joe or Kamala in the primary, that's probably what it would have to look like, because older African-American voters are very, they're very loyal to the Democratic Party establishment. I think they'll back Joe like 100%. They'll back Kamala 100% if it's her. So you have to work with the remainder of the coalition. And to me, the problem, I just don't know if you can ever form a coalition with those white suburbanites that's going to lead in a direction that ultimately gets us any further down the road, is kind of what I'm questioning right now.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I don't know if you read, there was an article a few months ago in Jacobin by Matt Karp. It's called like, "This is the future." Liberals want. That was about this exact thing. And I mean, I think it's a huge problem, because I'm not going to say it's impossible. I think that, Bernie Sanders did come very, very close to winning this time. I think that if the centrist candidates hadn't consolidated, in the way that they did, and I mean, whatever, we can play what if and who knows, right? But I think, I think that some people were way too quick to just sort of jump to this kind of extreme pessimism about that, that the fix is in, it can never happen, because it sort of seems like, okay, if you're watching a hockey game and and your team is winning for the first two periods, and then they start messing up and they lose, right? I think jumping to, there's no way they ever could.
And there's no way they'll ever win.
Yeah, exactly, right? So I think it's possible, but I think there is a huge problem there, because these kind of more like affluent suburban liberal voters are the people who are much more likely to vote in Democratic primaries. You have to be kind of, or any or their equivalents, right? Because to even vote in a primary in the first place, you have to be a little bit more plugged in. Like you had not everybody, tons of people. I mean, I went to Nevada to canvass for Bernie Sanders, in February, right? You talk to tons of people who don't even know, when the state's caucus or, primary day is, right? Yeah. That's very common. So I think that it is structurally a problem. I think it could happen. And I guess maybe it's just incredibly hard, right? Because of this problem. But that said, I think kind of going back to what you were saying about the quadrant of the population that's culturally conservative, but open to or even supportive of economically left-wing things. I think that at least in the US, I think it might be different in some developing countries, or, countries where like the political system is less solidified, but
Yeah.
at least in the US, I think that structurally, I think you couldn't really get a right-wing populist like movement in power that actually carried out like the economic stuff. And you could, at least in principle, it'd be obviously, right? I mean, it's like saying that, you could, whatever, like you could, that you could, that like you could make it into, into some like incredibly prestigious competition or something. You probably won't, right? But you could,
Right.
that like you could get a successful like Bernie style social democratic coalition that actually did carry out its stuff. And I tend to think the reason that could happen, and the right wing one, it's much harder to see how it could happen, is that since there are those like really deeply vested interests you're talking about in both parties for sure, right? That would block it, that like you need some kind of counterweight to counteract that. And obviously, like this itself feels like a fantasy because we're living in such dismal circumstances right now, that hellscape you were talking about earlier.
Right.
But a revitalized labor movement could play that role on the left.
It's the only way forward. I mean, in my view, it's the only way forward, because what does this project always crash on the rocks of? It's always, the divisions of race. And the Union Hall is the most desegregated, it's the most integrated political space in America. And I mean, also like the labor movement at this point, disproportionately Black and brown.
Right.
But this is the only way that it actually happens, that you have a worker centric, like a working class centric movement where you can bridge those divides and have a coalition that works and makes sense. Like, to me, that's the only path forward.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
One of the things that's concerning to me is that I think a lot of the left, frankly, because the labor movement has been so destroyed and is so anemic at this point in terms of a percent of the population, like a lot of young people have never been more supportive of labor unions. Labor union approval rating is like about historic levels of highs, but there's not a lot of direct experience with it. Right. So it's like a theoretical support, but it's, again, never pushed as like, this is the number one priority, and here's how we're going to get to this goal, and here's the legislation that we're going to pass. It's actually going to enable people to be able to organize and form unions. And so to me, that's where a lot of the work needs to be done, is on putting that agenda front and center, because I do not see another plausible path forward, frankly.
Yeah, right. No, for sure. I mean, I think that obviously it's an incredibly heavy lift to rebuild that, but that's the only thing that could do it, right? For sure.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to switch gears a little in the last few minutes, and think about, because I think there's like a natural tie-in, because what we've been talking about for the last few minutes is why you couldn't have look, I mean, just like, put it this way, right? Like why there is a way forward for the sort of populism represented by the Krystal half of the Rising, right? But it's much harder to see what that would look like to actually enact your co-host agenda, because there'd be no equivalent, right, social force there. And I think that a lot of people on the left, maybe like sort of, I guess I want to separate it out, because I think that like some of it is just dumb, but I think that but then like some of it, they're like, there's like a real issue there that, that we could talk about, right? So the like dumb critique is, oh, you co-host a show with a conservative, so therefore you're like, I don't know, just pretending to be a leftist, or, you secretly love Trump and Tucker Carlson or whatever, right? Like that's the dumb version. But then like the, and whatever. I mean, I think that we'd be much better off if there were a lot more shows, frankly, that were like, co-hosted by like somebody who, like, instead of doing the usual mainstream media thing where you have somebody who's like barely a liberal, and then somebody who's who's this like
Bush Republican.
Yeah, this like Bush Republican who represents like 2% of the population. That you had more places where people who were real leftists could reach an audience that they wouldn't reach if it were just them, right? So I think that makes perfect sense to me. But then I guess like the other half of it is like how how to think of it in terms of like, obviously, in that role, right? You're going to, I think, do things like tend to pick stories that like, where that like represent some sort of like area of mutual interest, which oftentimes, means economic stuff, and that makes perfect sense. But then like, I think that the danger that some people might see is then like the distinction ends up getting blurred, or, or it ends up, or you end up not like, or like somebody could like, I think the worry that people have is like somebody could watch that and they just think, oh, well, populism, whatever. It's all
right. It's all the same.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I hear those critiques and I take them in, and I really do, especially the ones that are, more thoughtful, as you put it. And I guess here's my thing. I feel right now that the country is absolutely breaking apart. If you ask people, something like 70% of Americans believe this election is going to end in violence. Some ridiculous percent believes that if their candidate doesn't win, that democracy will literally be over. And I think that the cable news media, this is like a little bit of a long answer, but yeah. I buy into Matt Taibbi's thesis that cable news media has basically decided, since they don't have the Cold War anymore and the Islamic terrorism thing isn't working as well as like a national enemy, they've created our fellow citizens as the enemy, right? So it's no longer some scary outside threat. Now it's your neighbor. Now it's your friend. Now it's your cousin who has a different ideology than you. And obviously, being on the left, we see this really clearly from liberals who, Trump is literal Hitler. And if you support Trump, you're enabling Hitler and you're a Nazi enabler. I mean, just like the most vicious rhetoric, not just aimed at elites, which, listen, to me, go to town when it comes to elites, like pull no punches, all of that, but aimed at everyone who either voted for Trump or didn't vote for Hillary. That's 70% of the population, right? That either didn't vote at all, voted for Trump, voted third party. And so if you're literally saying all of those people are out of bounds to even have a conversation with, I don't know how that you move forward as a country.
No, for sure. And I was just going to throw in there that I think that's a, also not only combined is that a majority of the population, right? But we're talking about a much more diverse group than people say in this often imagine.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so, there are some views that Sagar has that we have gotten into very ugly fights over, and that have, like, those times have been hard to deal with and confront and have that dialogue, which I think is reflective of an ugliness and messiness, frankly, that's happening in a lot of families and relationships across the country right now. And maybe this is hokey, but I just fundamentally don't believe in this idea of like, well, I know who the right moral actor is and who's good and who's bad. And if we push people out of the public sphere, that's the way to win and move forward. I don't think it works that way. I think you actually empower people by saying like, oh, this idea is so difficult and so dangerous. We can't even talk about it. We can't even talk to people who hold that idea. It makes it cooler and sexier than it deserves to be ultimately.
Yeah, there are a lot of careers on the right that are entirely built on that.
Absolutely, 100%. So listen, everybody always talks about how you're creating a pipeline to the alt-right. What they never think about is how you build a bridge back. And this is not just me theorizing. I get the messages, I see the responses, because we have this space of dialogue where people who really profoundly disagree with me on certain things appreciate that at least I'm there for the dialogue. They listen to me and my views about maybe Donald Trump a lot more than they would, an MSNBC space or like a homogenous space where you just have all left views. So you actually create a space where you can persuade people and bring them over to some leftist views, to some more moderate views, some less disastrous in my view or cruel views. That space exists in Rising. And I think if you just have a monoculture and you just try to like push people out of the public sphere, I think it's incredibly counterproductive and doesn't ultimately lead you where you want to go. Look, we have to acknowledge reality as it exists. And a lot of the working class, predominantly the white working class, but actually the multiracial working class in general, has views that you and I would really disagree with and find very problematic. If our goal is a multiracial working class movement, we aren't going to get there if we're like, okay, well, these ones are evil, and so we're not dealing with you at all. We just want to pick and choose the parts of it that we're comfortable with. That's not going to lead anywhere ultimately.
Yeah, right. And I think like I will say, like, especially over the summer, which is when I think you probably had a lot of those most contentious conversations, right?
Especially about policing and protests. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So I will, like, look, I'll say I often, listen to the Joe Rogan show would like usually when I run, because like all the other podcasts that I listen to, usually it's like hard to focus in that time, but like I think just kind of like listening to usually Rogan talking to some comedian or mixed martial arts guy, I can kind of do that, right? While I'm disoriented. But so over the summer I listened to the one that you guys did on there, and which was a time, right, when I think that, Rogan's all over the place. This was one of the times that, you had one of the takes I most, vociferously disagree with.
Yes.
And I thought, like, listening to the way that you you did push back very hard, especially on the question of all the stuff that was going around at the time about sending the military, into cities to suppress the post-George Floyd unrest, that I guess at a certain point, right, I wonder what a lot of the people who make this criticism want in that situation, right? Like, is the correct approach to just say, you guys are fascists, I'm not talking to you anymore, and literally just like end the Zoom call or whatever, right? Is it to scream at them, because if it's not one of those things, then I think it would have to be what you did, which was to, like to push back hard, but in a way that is clearly about trying to persuade people who don't start from the same place, rather than like just telling them that they're bad people for having this view.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak in too broad terms, because I think there are people who are like, who really are thoughtful about these issues and have problems with Rising and have expressed them, and like that's fine. That's their right to have those views, and I agree that it's kind of a complicated and complex issue. But I just think from a purely strategic point of view, if you want to make progress and you want to build a movement, increasingly like narrowing the scope of who you're even allowed to talk to or engage with is completely counterproductive. And unfortunately, on Twitter in particular, and social media in general, what is often rewarded is that kind of, it's very cheap and easy of like picking this fight and signaling that you're more pure and more left and more whatever than everybody else. And it's not actually about reaching a goal. There's no end goal in mind other than signaling your own personal virtue in this moment. And I think that has been deeply destructive, especially post Bernie, because Bernie was kind of this galvanizing force and kind of kept everybody on the same page. And after him, there's a little bit of a vacuum and a little bit of a free-for-all, and certainly a lot of like intra-left squabbling, which, okay, fine, whatever. Sure. But I think that the instinct to signal personal virtue over any sort of strategic objective of how do we build a coalition that actually is going to win power and actually advance the issues and the ideals that we care about, that piece to me is what has been kind of most troubling about this time, because I just think bottom line is it's extraordinarily counterproductive and will destroy any hope of being able to build and move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think part of the issue is that I think a lot of people maybe like mix up two things they should keep separate, that it goes back to what you're saying about elites versus your uncle,
Right.
who voted for Trump, which is they'll say things like, "Oh, you can't convince these people," but it's really unclear what these people in that sentence is, right? Like,
Yeah.
is that Donald Trump? Is that Tucker Carlson? Or is that like
Every person who voted for Donald Trump, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. And then like I think the other part is that I wonder how much of this stuff is just kind of a hangover from, because like the emergence of some kind of like real social democratic left in the US is such a recent thing that that like 5 years ago, well, actually 5 years ago, literally when Bernie Sanders announced that he was running for president, he announced it to like 10 people. And so it's this super recent development. And generally speaking, the like any kind of perspective to the left of liberalism has been super marginal in the United States for a very, very, very long time. And I think that in that marginality, like people get used to thinking of politics purely as like taking a stand, as a kind of like performance of moral dissent from whatever horrible stuff is going on. So like, I love Noam Chomsky, but like you read Chomsky, there's like never a place in any of that where he sort of pauses to be like, okay, well, what if there was like a socialist government that took power in the United States? How would it handle these issues? Because it would just never come up, right? Because he's been formed at a time when that would feel like such a like silly fantasy to like even bother with that. But then the problem is that when you do start to get some opportunities to to build a movement and maybe even take power, you still got that habit, right? That you think of politics primarily in terms of demonstrating your individual moral commitment, and that makes it really easy to then get into the habit. If that's all it is, right? Then like, oh, then instead of taking people who don't agree with you about everything, but like maybe are willing to support you, might have bad like cultural attitudes on some things, but like maybe they're even willing to put those aside for the sake of getting some of what they want, instead of saying, oh, good, right? Like that means like that you might win because more people support you. To have this instinct to say, well, okay, since what we're doing is we're exhibiting our moral commitment to opposing whatever's going on, then when new people show up, your impulse is to like interrogate whether they really have the right moral commitment, right? Like, are they really committed or enough or not? And if they aren't, then they don't get to be in the they don't get to be in the club. They're not really.
And can I just say this is something I was thinking about today. I actually, hilariously, because of a Ken Bone tweet. I don't know if you followed this particular Ken Bone saga, but he tweeted that he supported Hillary in 2016. This time around, he decided to cast his ballot for Joe Jorgensen, the Libertarian third-party candidate. And he then followed up that with a tweet indicating that Trump people had all been really nice to him about his decision, and that liberals, I think in particular, had kind of lost their mind. You're a Nazi collaborator, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he had this note at the end that was like, I don't think you all realize how much that reaction pushes people to the right. And so that little gem of Ken Bone wisdom I've been sort of chewing on today. And it made me realize that, humans were not particularly rational, right? Most people, you and I have spent a lot of time thinking about like, this is where we stand on the issues, and this is my ideological framework, and this is how I think about the world. Like, most people are not doing that. And that's not a knock on them. They're just like doing other things with their lives. And so a lot of what your views end up defaulting to is whatever club you feel you're a part of. So taking the Ken Bone example, in that moment, the people that made him feel welcome and like he was part of their club was the right. And so if you're not a particularly ideologically formed person, if that's the group that is accepting you as part of their tribe and making you feel welcome, well, over time, guess what's going to happen? You're going to start to see things their way. You're going to start to look at the world through this lens. Before you know it, you're a full-fledged right-winger, right? The same thing can happen on the left. If you make people feel welcome, if they're in the club and you kind of signal to them like we're all part of the same tribe, over time, you will win them over. Like their views will change to morph and to fit that ideological lens. If you are shutting the door on increasing numbers of people and explicitly telling them, like, we don't want you, we think you're evil, we think you're irredeemable, we think you're doing all these horrible things, like the worst things you can think of, yeah, they're not going to agree with you. You're never going to win them over that way. And so in a lot of ways, it's just sort of human psychology and the way that we work. And we have to be, if we want to build, we have to be realistic about those things.
Yeah, for sure. And that just seems like, put that way, right? That just seems so obvious. Yes, of course, most humans are going to react better to people who, are, making the hey, welcome, right?
Not being assholes to
yes,
them.
not being complete assholes to them, right? Then
brilliance for the day.
yeah, for sure, right? And that sounds super obvious, but if you are around a lot of left-wing spaces, a lot of people certainly don't act like they believe that, right? Like that they are really, really fixated on coming up with reasons to like make a negative moral judgment about like any given individual, even if it's if it's not like a decision maker. It's not it's Ken Bone, right? I mean, what's the, like you're talking literally about one person who you maybe sort of vaguely remember as a punchline from 2016, and he's just this like completely powerless random individual voter, but you're still coming up with reasons to morally condemn him.
Right.
And it seems like a lot of that has to do with like, because I wondered about this a lot, right, over the summer, when there was that, that post George Floyd moment, that you would think would have that same kind of galvanizing effect you're talking about with Bernie Sanders earlier, that like would really like reorient a lot of people on the left towards like the high priority things, because hey, this is this like real issue. This is like literally a matter of life and death. But instead of that, you started to get a lot of focus on often like the pettiest possible symbolic victories.
Right.
And like literally, so there's like a military base that was named after was named after some terrible historical figure, and we're still going to have like planes that like fly out of it that that kill people abroad, but we're not going to name it that. And
you
so
have the right name on it. Yeah.
And I think that like a lot of that is, well, actually changing the way policing works would be incredibly difficult. It's a huge political lift, whereas getting something's name changed, getting somebody fired, getting somebody like pressuring some company just to say the right combination of words in the right order about Black lives, all that stuff is really easy and really winnable, because like those are things you can do that people will do for you, so that you'll like stop being mad at them and you'll move on
Right.
to the next case. And it seems like a lot of this stuff is that same impulse in this like really small scale, like, I can't actually like, well, okay, you can yell at Donald Trump on Twitter, he just won't notice. But like, I can't do that. But this random person over here, right, I can let them know that they suck, and that might actually ruin their day. And that ends up feeling like some sort of miniature pseudo victory.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's really true. And I mean, and part of why obviously the protest movement collapsed to these more symbolic gestures is because not only are they easy, they're comfortable. They're comfortable for like all the corporations who wanted to be involved and wanted, Amazon putting Black Lives Matter on their homepage and whatever. Like Jamie Dimon, remember that picture? Did you see that? Like kneeling in a bank vault.
Oh yeah.
I was like, oh no. Those things are comfortable, right? They don't actually challenge or threaten the bottom line of the people who run this country. And So yeah, I think you're right. I think that kind of translates into the Twitter space too, where in the absence of being able to win real victories, like this is a small way to have a sense of power. And I also want to say, I get it. Like,
Right?
it is a very dangerous moment in American history. There's no denying that. I mean, I feel this country is unraveling. It's spinning out of control between 2020, obviously, in particular. I mean, between the pandemic and the lockdowns and the loss of work and people being unable to pay their rent or their mortgage or their utility bills. I mean, I saw a story about the insane number of people who can't pay their electric and their water bills. I mean, all these things coming due. And meanwhile, because it's such a tremendously unequal recession where the top 20% is either completely unaffected or are actually doing better than they were before, the whole thing, all the pain is just like invisible to the people who have power. And so you have that layered on top of this incredibly fraught political moment where both sides feel like their literal lives are at stake in the election, like it is truly existential. And so the temperature is just turned up as hot as it possibly could be. And in that environment, I really think we should be cutting each other as much slack as we possibly can, even for things that I think are petty or silly or wrong or bad takes or whatever. Like, people are freaked out and they're depressed and they're sad and they're anxious and they're angry and they're fearful. And a lot of people are not at their best selves right now and not really thinking clearly about how we are going to be able to collectively move forward as a country. So, my policy is basically to try to cut people slack during this time and, try to see the best. It's so hokey, but it's really true. Like, try to see the best part of the person, as annoying or obnoxious as they may be, especially our fellow citizens, not like, again, the elites, like the people who have screwed this whole thing up, fuck them. But I get that it's a fraught time, and I understand why people have these very visceral reactions to viewpoints and people articulating viewpoints that they find abhorrent. Like, I really do get that. I just think ultimately that direction of discourse is not going to get us anywhere, but more of where we are today, which is a very ugly place.
Well, lots of people are not at their best selves right now, but that was great. Thank you so much for coming on, Krystal.
It's my pleasure, Ben. Thank you so much. It's great chatting with you.
All right, thanks. Joined by Cole James Cash, who is substituting today for the great David Griscom. Can't be with us to do his usual segment, but I am excited to have Cole on. He is, among other things, he hosts what I think is now just called the Cole James Cash Show, and he also has another show in development at Means TV. Not for nothing, he, for people who are familiar with Jesse Lee Peterson and the famous or infamous debate that I did with him, if you haven't seen it, you should check out Cole's encounter with Jesse, which I think lasted literally less than 5 minutes before Peterson pulled the plug because he's so used to being able to say crazy things and have people just take it seriously and try to patiently explain whatever's wrong with the crazy thing that he said, and Cole didn't humor it. So that is a lot of fun to watch. But what we want to talk about today is actually his music for this usual music segment at the end of the show. And if you're not aware of this, constantly people are telling me how much they like the intro music on the show, and that was a gift from Cole. So welcome, Cole.
You know what's funny is that Anna Kasparian messaged me today, and it was because I singled out the fact that Nico House is hanging out with like Jack Posobiec and all that, and I debated Nico House, and the story about that was Nico had disrespected Anna, so Michael is like, yo, I got to jump in and defend, right? And then Michael, there's certain things he's not gonna say.
Right.
Michael's not going to say, yo, you trying to smash Tulsi Gabbard, and that's all there is to it, bro. You're an opportunist just like her. Michael's not going to say that. And believe me, I'm being very judicious. I'm being very civil. Sure. And also, to quote Patrice O'Neill, I had to get at Nico House in a very black way, because he's used to, Ben, you know how much I respect you, but there's certain things you can't. Nico House is a house Negro. You know it, but you can't say that. I can.
You can, yeah.
And so like he proved that today, and Anna, found a lot of joy. I'm bringing this up because both of us was cool, Michael, and Anna was like really happy just to hear that, like, how that happened. She didn't know, So I jumped in to, not because I'm trying to be this, house Negro myself, like, oh, my white master, Michael. No, it's because Michael's my friend, and I'm like, nah, man, this guy's used to going against other white folks who are going to be nice to him. He walks into a room of black folks talking what you talk about, that ain't gonna fly. So I'm glad that we were proven right. I only wish Michael was here to see it, that we were right all along. Sorry I had to come with that intro, but I just thought you'd want to know that, man.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I actually did also, much more politely, debate Nico myself during the primary about Tulsi Gabbard, and that guy will just sit there and say with a straight face things that like literally like anybody who watches the news knows aren't true.
Can I just say this, is that when you watch the first couple minutes of that debate with him, he had been posting on Reddit that he spoke Spanish fluently and that he spoke Portuguese, and I had this moment like in Inglourious Bastards where I said in Spanish, I told him, you can look at it, Ben. I'll send you the link, bro. I say in Spanish, I said something like, how about we can do part of the interview in Spanish since you're so fluent. Then he says like, oh, no, yo sé falar portugués. He said like, oh, something carioca, like basically implying that I speak Portuguese of Rio de Janeiro descent. And I said, oh, I replied in Portuguese. I'm like, yeah, I speak Portuguese too, bro. Yo, holla at my mama. And it's just like, he was just like shocked, bro. I pulled his card so quick, man. It was a glorious. Sorry,
yeah. That's that scene where they're gonna go. They're gonna pose as Italian journalists to go to the premiere.
Yes.
And say, all right, well, he speaks the most Italian. Speaks second. Well, you speak the third most Italian. It's like, I don't speak Italian. Yeah, like I said, you speak the third most, and then they actually show up at the party, and Brad Pitt's doing the buongiorno.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, Ben, like it was a glorious moment. Like I said, I know the Jesse Lee Peterson, thank you for setting that up for me. That's what they get for bothering you. Like the wolf, I came in and solved the problem, bro. Go ahead, Ben. It's your show, man.
All right. Two Tarantino references in a row. I like it. So yeah, although the movie that I was thinking of with that, because just to set this up, well, I'm familiar with this. I did this debate with Jesse Lee Peterson, which is one of the most bizarre conversations I've ever been in my life. And then afterwards, Peterson's producer, kept like sending me messages. Oh, is there some other like leftist you can suggest you want to come on to argue with Jesse? And so suggesting Cole for that was kind of in the same spirit of if you've ever seen Good Will Hunting, there's a scene in there where there's like an interview he doesn't want to go to. And he says he's going to send his representative. So watch that sometime. Know what I'm talking about. But I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about your musical career. So you want to set this up for us a little bit, talk about the kind of thing you usually do.
So yeah, this is, we're gonna talk about 2016. It was an album that I made at the time. I was recovering from a shooting/robbery that happened to me. And it was a really tough time because you understand, like, I went through like drug rehab and like fixed my life only to basically by chance. I'm from Oakland, and it just happened while walking to work, man. It was a crime of chance, And I started working on this album 2016 because I started to, when Trump had won, it was kind of whatever to me, but not because politics doesn't affect me. I'm just like, I have low expectations of white people, man. So, unless you vetted like my man Ben, man, like I'm not really rocking with you like that. But it was when I began to realize that a lot of white folks started feeling themselves. And my boy, who's Asian, he got a note that said that, it was a racial slur and everything. He's like, yo, this just happened to me. I'm like, and he lives in a town called Morgan Hill, which is near Gilroy, San Jose. And so I started working on this album that would sort of reflect how I was feeling. Mm-hmm. And I covered everything from, Backpage getting removed. I covered Standing Rock. I covered, the song called Deplorable, a song called Grabbing by Poverty. Don't Cheat on Your Girl, because I had actually ruined my relationship because I was caught cheating. And it was just all kinds of, it was all kinds of stuff that I had covered. But they shut down Backpage was a big one to me because I know a lot of sex workers, and I'm friends with, some adult, as Seinfeld would say, public fornicators, and them shutting down Backpage it caused a lot more problems than it helped. And I couldn't stand Kamala Harris at that point because I was like, dude, you already had this crappy policy and this and that. So I'm from California, so my Kamala dislike has been going on for a while, and I covered that on that album. And like I said, there's a song called Gentrified Cheesesteaks, and it was just like something that reflected how I felt at the time. I don't rap or sing, so I have to do everything instrumentally if I don't have rappers or singers.
Yeah, fair enough. So let me just play one track from that album right now. So this is one that is called The President-Elect.
My favorite song on there, right? Easily.
chose, right? So, I mean.
In 4 years?
Or unless somebody takes him out.
Said unless somebody takes him out. That seems very inflammatory.
4 years, right? But, like, I mean, look what happened to Martin Luther King. And people got assassinated, right? So you never know. Maybe somebody might do the same with them.
Oh, yeah, that got me. I just, listened to that, like that really, I get a little knot in my stomach, because I think about like when he was first elected, and I remember I was talking to my wife Jennifer about it, and she was like, the whole day, she's like, God, it feels like somebody just died.
Yeah, for me, it was, I always viewed America as, I'm like, this is just what it is. It's just there is no mask. But my problem was that people felt emboldened to, those quotes were actually Canadian, and I liked what they were saying, And the thing is that, like I said, those quotes were exactly what I was feeling at the time. Like, and it was. I know for my kid's mom, we were still kind of together at the time, and she's not a citizen, Big shout out to Ronald Reagan, who is her lawyer, okay? Also shout out to Ronald Reagan for winning asylum for one of her gay friends from Venezuela, man. He did it,
So
Anyhow.
just to be clear, because I think some people might.
Oh, my bad. Stephen Robbins, immigration lawyer.
Yeah.
Great guy. He lives out in Washington, but yeah, so basically, like, it was how I was feeling. I basically got to talk about everything I was feeling. One thing that's kind of funny is that there's actually there's a song called "Marriage" on there, and you got to understand, like, don't get me wrong, like I was still watching TYT like extensively, and I knew who Sam was and stuff, but I wasn't online like that, So I had actually pulled some quotes from Paul Joseph Watson. And I didn't know who he was. And he's talking about, like, yo, women ain't trying to get married, man. They ain't trying to, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that sounds interesting. I'm just whatever. And then when I found out who he was, like 6 months later, I'm like, yo, I'm deleting the hell out of that. Paul Joseph Watson is one of those guys that he'll be like semi-reasonable, and then he'll just go into some dumb stuff. Ben, I'm trying to censor myself, bro. And like, so it's just like that, it was just everything about that album was just what I was feeling. Like I said, a song called Make Ends Meet, and like I said, Standing Rock was a big deal to me. Like, I made it at the time, and that was what I was feeling at the time, relearning to walk and things like that. And like I said, I really enjoyed
because you really, like, in that, I've heard you talk about that instant before, when like you really had some severe injuries.
Yes, I was beaten so badly in my head. I was pistol whipped repeatedly that I had a hematoma in the back of my head, which is like a big blood clot. They thought I got shot in the back of the head, but I was shot twice in the leg. They weren't aiming for my leg, they were not aiming for my leg. And they grabbed my work computer and my Xbox One at the time. I want to give a big shout out to one of my fans, because like I said, I was a musician before any of this. And I should introduce myself as Means TV signee, Coach James Cash. Like, before I got any of this cool stuff going, before Sam Cedar became my dad, I was a musician, and I'm well documented in talking about activism. You can find interviews of me talking about it and talking about the importance of fatherhood and activism and things like that. I've often find this, Ben, that like, I've been empathetic to communism, and I knew, socialism through black nationalism, guys like Fred Hampton. I've known that most of my life.
Yeah.
But it really doesn't matter what you call yourself. It's what you do.
Right.
Because, Ben, I don't punch left. Right. I don't spend my time slapping liberals because I have liberals in my family, and liberals in my philosophy is those are the people we're going to convert at some point. They're the ones that are actually going to listen. And I just prefer to try to, because when you go door to door a lot, damn well that you don't talk like you tweet. I don't like to be a reactionary, I like to focus on what can people do? My show, now the Cole James Cash Show, because Nick and Naomi from Means, they own Ghetto News Network now. I just like to focus on actionable stuff. It's like you have, your book, the book, Give Them an Argument. I'm like, yo, this is what I can use to explain to people these types of right-wing things that they say, this and that, blah, 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 like actionable stuff. And that's what's most important for me. As you specialize in, there's an intellectual left that is fooled by guys like Ben Shapiro and things like that. In all honesty, Ben, people you relate to, your folks, some nerdy folks, a lot of nerdy white folks, etc. You take care of them for real, man. You take care of them. So I do my best to take care of my folks in what I do. And Michael, he tried to bring everybody together. It's because of him we even are cool with each other.
Yeah.
It was because of him we are even cool with each other. And I get really sad thinking about it because he never got to see me get signed. He never got to see me get elevated to the position that he wanted me to be in.
Yeah, no, I mean, every day, right? I think especially now that I'm doing this show, right? 3 times a day, right? Some days, I feel that itch to text him about what's going on with it, So, yeah, why don't, but no, that's great. I'm really happy for you that you did get that Means TV deal.
Thank you.
Do you want to, because I saw you post about this a little while ago, just to kind of wrap up here, do you want to talk a little bit about what you see coming up as far as the musical side of your career?
Let's see, honesty, what's funny is that, Napoleon the Legend, right?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Me and him go back 7 years, bro.
Really?
I always explain
that.
to people, one of the biggest reasons you can't cancel people in entertainment, because we all know each other.
Yeah.
Everybody knows each other. It's like Jakeson knows some folks, etc. In New York, I know a lot of rappers, bro. And Napoleon's one of them. He knows my homies. I got family in NYC and all that. It's like, we all know each other. So he contacted me. He's like, yo, I didn't know you was down with this. I'm like, yeah, bro, good to see you, Kareem, man. What's up with you? And it's like, it's such a, we're entertainers first. And the thing is what I will say is, like I said, as far as music goes, I have an EP called Comrade Britney that he and my boy Lex is on. And in it, I basically take Britney Spears interviews and I elevate her. And, basically, I've always been empathetic to Britney Spears. She's never done anything to anyone. And I never liked how her mental issues were made to be it was like she was going crazy. When, bro, she was just going through it, And I have that. And then I actually have an album called Lush Life, based after the novel from Richard Price, my favorite author. Richard Price, there's 2 white writers I love. Richard Price, David Simon, and one more, Brian Azzarello, who writes comics. It's because they know how to write
stuff by Brian Azzarello. Yeah.
Yeah, but 100 Bullets is my favorite comic book, one of my favorite books ever. And they're the only white folks I truly trust to write black people, man. Richard Price is good, and he knows our folks, and he knows cops too. He knows how these individuals operate. And so I named my album Lush Life because that book is about a shooting. It's about a shooting and things like that. And that's my album dedicated to what happened to me. And but in it, I took pieces from the book. I basically scored a book. There's 3 rap songs and 1 ballad, but I scored a book, and I sort of channeled that to kind of help me get over the shooting. And it's just that will be coming out by the end of the year. But Comrade Britney will be out in about a month, so I'm very excited about that. And the last one, the album that put me on the map was an album called BBW, a pornographic opera, where I spotlighted some of my homies that are public fornicators, and one appeared on the album. I'm very close to one. Her name's Casey Parker. I'm doing a second one, which is 4 songs and 4 girls named. We all homies, and that's that. That will be coming out probably around January. And yeah, and until then, I'm just concentrating on the production meetings with Means. And it's the show with me and my homegirl, Dahlia St. Knives. I'll just tell you right now, Ben, I am an unapologetic scumbag, but I'm always respectful, man. I don't clean up my language, but I don't look to offend. You don't have to be a jerk to people. You don't have to misgender people on purpose, things like that. But on the other hand, I could still speak within the bounds of my community so people know, yo, you talking to one of your own is good. But when I'm on this show, man, I clean it up. I clean it up very well. I think I did very good. And shout out to you, man, for last time you came on my show, man. When you talked about reading Ben Shapiro books, man. Yo. Hold up, Ben, before you go, isn't it funny how these dudes, like, they want so badly to get into this world. So they have to astroturf. They what I mean by they want to get in entertainment. Guys like Brian Kilmeade. I had an agent once, I think, from CCA. Like, I'm not that clout, but I do know a guy, you know, and he was telling me, these dudes badly want to get in and they can't because nobody likes them. You know, nobody likes them. And it's like, these guys badly want to be in that liberal world. And when they can't get in, they like try to say this and that and the other or whatever. But Ben, you know this, man. Those right wingers are desperately trying to get into the liberal media that they say they dislike.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of that. Thank you so much, Cole. This was really good.
Yo, no problem. Ben, it's really good to see you, man.
Absolutely.
Really good to see you. And don't forget my message I texted you the other day, man. I'm really glad that you're here, man. I know it's been tough the last 8 months, but I'm glad you're here, man. All right, Ben. Much love to you and your wife, man. Bye.
Thanks, Cole. Right. Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to cut it for today. I really next week we are going to be back with David Griscom for a very extended version of Outlaws and Revolutionaries, because we are going to be interviewing Matthew Sitman, who is one of the two co-hosts of the Know Your Enemy podcast, which is a really interesting podcast by leftists talking about the right. And in particular, so I'm going to be talking to Sitman about, well, first of all, at the beginning of the episode, I'm going to be talking to my good friend and comrade and frequent co-author, Matt McManus, about an article that he wrote for Jacobin about the relationship between liberalism and socialism that got a lot of people mad. So I think there's a lot to talk about there. We are also going to then Matt is going to be sticking around for the first half hour of the interview with the other Matt, that's Matthew Sitman, to talk about the Know Your Enemy podcast. And then at the halfway mark of the show, David Griscom, who's going to be back next week, is going to come back to help me interview Matthew Sitman about an article that he wrote for Dissent about country music and leftism. So that is an episode that I'm really looking forward to. I will see you all then. Left is best.